The smoke-filled atmosphere of the Hammersmith Odeon in London was thick with anticipation and the acrid smell of cigarettes on that cold November evening in 1973. The legendary venue, which had become a pilgrimage site for rock fans across Britain and Europe, was packed to capacity with 3,500 devoted followers eager to witness Black Sabbath at the absolute height of their dark powers. This was the band that had essentially invented heavy metal, the Birmingham quartet that had taken the traditional blues rock template and twisted it into something altogether more sinister, powerful, and revolutionary. The stage was bathed in deep purple and red lights that cast eerie shadows across the venue's ornate Victorian interior, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that perfectly complemented Black Sabbath's growing reputation as the darkest, most dangerous band in rock music. Massive, Marshall amplifier stacks towered on either side of the stage like monolithic sentinels of sonic destruction, while Tony Iommi's guitar cases bore the scars and stickers of countless tours across Britain, Europe, and their recent breakthrough performances in America. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation as roadies in denim and leather made final adjustments to equipment that would soon unleash sonic devastation upon the eager crowd. The smell of patchouli oil mixed with cigarette, smoke, and spilled beer, creating the distinctive aroma of early 1970s rock venues. Concert-goers clutched their pints of bitter and passed around hand-rolled cigarettes, the blue smoke creating a hazy atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of normal time and space. This was 1973 Black Sabbath, young, hungry, and still riding the massive wave of success from their groundbreaking albums, Black Sabbath, Paranoid, and Master of Reality. They had just released Sabbath Bloody Sabbath to critical acclaim and commercial success, cementing their position as the undisputed kings of heavy music. Ozzy Osbourne, at just 24 years old, was still the wild child of rock, notorious for his unpredictable stage behavior and off-stage antics that had already become the stuff of legend among music journalists and devoted fans. Tony Iommi commanded his Gibson SG with the kind of dark mastery that would influence generations of metal musicians, his missing fingertips, the result of a childhood accident in a sheet metal factory, giving his playing a unique, haunting quality that perfectly matched the band's apocalyptic vision. Geezer Butler's bass lines provided the thunderous foundation for their revolutionary sound, his left-handed playing style and socialist political views adding intellectual weight to the band's working-class origins. Bill Ward's drumming drove the band forward with relentless power, his jazz-influenced fills and crushing rhythms creating the perfect backbone for their sonic assault on conventional music. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider leaving a like to show your support for stories about handling difficult situations with grace and unexpected wisdom. The crowd was a sea of long hair, denim jackets adorned with band patches, and heavy leather boots, the uniform of Britain's burgeoning heavy music scene. These weren't casual fans, but true believers, young people who had found in Black Sabbath's music something that spoke directly to their own feelings of alienation and rebellion against the established order. Many were working-class kids from Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool and London who saw in these four Birmingham lads a reflection of their own hopes and frustrations. The audience included factory workers who had spent their weekly wages on tickets, art students rebelling against their middle-class backgrounds, unemployed youth seeking escape from economic uncertainty, and devoted music fans who recognized that they were witnessing the birth of an entirely new form of musical expression. The energy was palpable, electric, and slightly dangerous, the kind of atmosphere that could only exist in the early days of a musical revolution. The show had been proceeding with typical Black Sabbath intensity, the band tearing through crowd favorites like Iron Man and War Pigs, with the kind of raw energy that only comes from musicians still hungry to prove themselves to the world. The performance of Iron Man had been particularly crushing, with Iommi's iconic riff reverberating through the venue's historic walls, while Ozzy's vocals soared over the massive wall of sound created by the rhythm section. War Pigs had transformed the venue into a cauldron of anti-establishment fervor, the song's powerful anti-war message resonating with a generation that had grown up watching the horrors of Vietnam unfold on television. The crowd sang along to every word, their voices, combining with Ozzy's, to create a collective expression of anger and defiance that seemed to shake the very foundations of the historic venue. Ozzy prowled the stage like a caged animal, his voice soaring over the crushing weight of Iommi's riffs, while the rhythm section of Butler and Ward created a foundation so solid and powerful it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into the bones of everyone present. The young frontman's stage presence was already legendary. He moved with an unpredictable energy that kept audiences transfixed, never knowing whether he might break into a gentle ballad or unleash a primal scream that could shatter glass. About halfway through their set, during the haunting opening moments of Planet Caravan, one of Black Sabbath's most experimental and atmospheric pieces, a disturbance erupted from the standing area directly in front of the stage. The song represented a complete departure from the band's heavier material, showcasing their ability to create beauty and transcendence alongside their more crushing compositions. A heavily intoxicated man in his early 20s, wearing a torn denim jacket over a faded Led Zeppelin t-shirt and clearly having consumed far too much beer both before and during the show, began shouting aggressively toward the stage. His appearance suggested he was a genuine music fan. His jacket was covered with band patches, his hair hung past his shoulders in the fashion of serious rock devotees, and his boots showed the wear of someone who attended concerts regularly. "This is bloody boring," the heckler slurred loudly, his voice cutting through the ethereal atmosphere that Black Sabbath had been carefully building with their delicate interpretation of the cosmic ballad. "Where's the heavy stuff? This sounds like bloody folk music. Play something that actually rocks." The disruption was particularly jarring because Planet Caravan required a level of attention and respect that this intoxicated fan was completely undermining. The song's delicate interplay between Iommi's clean guitar tones and the band's subtle rhythm work, combined with Ozzy's whispered vocals and the otherworldly production effects, created an atmosphere of space-age beauty that transported listeners beyond the confines of the dingy concert venue. The audience around the drunk man immediately began shouting at him to shut up, their anger obvious, and growing by the second. In the early 70s, music fans took their concerts seriously, and disrupting a performance was considered a serious breach of etiquette that could ruin the experience for hundreds of other people who had saved their money and traveled considerable distances to be there. "You call this heavy metal?" the man continued shouting, now swaying dangerously and nearly falling into the people around him, his beer sloshing over the rim of his plastic cup. "My little sister could write heavier music than this. Where's the bloody noise? Where's the power? This is soft as butter." The heckler's voice carried a distinct working-class accent that suggested he was from somewhere in the industrial Midlands, possibly even Birmingham itself. His criticism seemed to come not from ignorance but from disappointed expectations. He clearly knew the band's heavier material and was frustrated by their decision to showcase their more experimental side. Security guards, who in 1973 were far less organized and professional than their modern counterparts, started moving through the dense crowd toward the source of the disturbance. These were typically ex-bouncers from local pubs, big men in worn leather jackets who relied more on intimidation than training. The packed venue made it nearly impossible to reach the heckler quickly, and the confrontational atmosphere of early heavy metal shows meant that any security intervention had the potential to escalate into a much larger problem. The crowd around the heckler was getting increasingly agitated, with some fans beginning to push and shove in response to his continued disruptions. Others were shouting for him to be thrown out, while a few appeared ready to take matters into their own hands. The carefully controlled chaos that was a Black Sabbath concert was threatening to tip over into genuine disorder that could endanger everyone present. Tony Iommi, standing at his usual position stage left, continued playing the delicate guitar parts that made Planet Caravan so special, but his eyes were fixed on the disturbance in the crowd. Even at this early stage of their career, the guitarist had developed a reputation for being the most level-headed member of Black Sabbath, the one who could sense when situations needed careful handling rather than explosive confrontation. Geezer Butler, whose bass playing anchored the song's hypnotic rhythm, watched the situation unfold with growing concern. As the band's primary lyricist and most politically aware member, he understood better than most how quickly concert situations could spiral out of control. especially when alcohol and frustrated expectations were involved. Ozzy, who even at 24 had already developed a reputation for unpredictable responses to difficult situations, stopped singing and stared directly at the drunk man with an intensity that seemed to cut through the smoky air like a laser beam. The rest of the band, sensing something significant was about to happen, gradually brought their instruments to a halt, leaving only the hum of amplifiers and the murmur of a confused crowd. What happened next shocked everyone in the venue, from the seasoned roadies who had seen countless confrontations during their years on the road to the hardcore fans who thought they knew everything about Black Sabbath's volatile live performances and Ozzy's reputation for unpredictable behavior. Instead of unleashing the kind of verbal assault that rock stars were famous for, instead of having security immediately remove the troublemaker in the traditional manner, instead of responding with the aggression and confrontation that everyone expected from the Prince of Darkness, Ozzy set down his microphone stand and spoke directly to the intoxicated man. "Oi, mate!" Ozzy called out, his Birmingham accent thick and unmistakable, cutting through the ambient noise of the venue. "What's your name, then?" The heckler, apparently caught completely off guard by being directly addressed rather than attacked or ignored, stumbled both physically and verbally before responding. The unexpected attention seemed to momentarily sober him up, though his movements remained unsteady. Terry Higgins, and I've been following you lads since the very beginning, since those early gigs at the Crown in Birmingham, which is why this soft stuff is such a bloody disappointment." The mention of the Crown, a small pub venue where Black Sabbath had indeed played some of their earlier shows, indicated that Terry was a genuine long-time fan rather than a casual troublemaker. This detail seemed to register with all four band members, who exchanged glances that suggested they remembered those early days when their audience consisted of a few dozen dedicated followers. "Terry Higgins," Ozzy repeated thoughtfully, as if the name meant something important to him, and he was committing it to memory. "Terry, I want to ask you something, and I want a straight answer from you. How much have you had to drink tonight?" The question was so unexpected in the context of a 1973 heavy metal concert that it seemed to momentarily silence even Terry's alcohol-fueled bravado. The directness and apparent concern in Ozzy's voice was completely at odds with his reputation as rock's wildest performer. "What's it matter to you?" he shot back, but with noticeably less venom than his previous outbursts, as if Ozzy's calm tone was diffusing his aggressive energy. "Just answer the question, Terry. How much have you had to drink today?" The persistence and surprisingly calm tone of Ozzy's questioning seemed to penetrate Terry's defensive posture in a way that confrontation never could have. "Been at the pub since this afternoon," Terry admitted reluctantly, his defiance wavering under Ozzy's steady, non-judgmental gaze. "Started around 2 o'clock, I reckon." "And why were you at the pub since 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, Terry?" Ozzy asked, his voice now carrying a warmth that reached every person in the venue. The direct, non-confrontational nature of the question seemed to pierce through Terry's alcohol-fueled armor like a blade through paper. His aggressive posture began to sag visibly, his shoulders dropping as if the weight of his circumstances was suddenly pressing down on him with tremendous force. "Lost my bloody job at the factory yesterday, didn't I?" Terry said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion that alcohol hadn't quite managed to numb. 26 years old and already on the scrap heap. Supervisor said they're cutting back, moving production to Germany, where they can pay workers half what they pay us here. The entire venue had gone completely silent now, the kind of profound quiet that indicated everyone was not just listening, but truly hearing what was being said. This wasn't the usual dynamic of a Black Sabbath concert, where chaos and volume typically reigned supreme, and personal conversation was impossible. "Been working there since I left school at 16, Terry continued, the words pouring out of him as if a dam had burst. 10 years of my life, getting up at 5 in the morning, working with my hands until they bled, thinking I was building something for my future. Now they tell me I'm redundant, unnecessary, no longer required." Tony Iommi, who had experienced his own share of working-class struggles growing up in industrial Birmingham, watched this interaction with growing interest and empathy. The guitarist understood exactly what Terry was going through, the feeling of being discarded by a system that viewed workers as expendable commodities. rather than human beings with families and dreams. Got a girlfriend talking about marriage, parents asking when I'm going to get my life sorted, and here I am with no job, no prospects, and no bloody idea what comes next, Terry said, his voice now barely above a whisper, but somehow audible throughout the silent venue. Thought coming to see you lot might remind me what it felt like to believe in something, to feel like there was still some fight left in the world. Ozzy nodded slowly, and those close to the stage could see something profound shift in his expression. Despite his reputation as rock's wild man, the young performer possessed an emotional intelligence that allowed him to recognize genuine pain when he encountered it. Terry, Ozzy continued, his voice now carrying a warmth and authority that reached every person in the venue. I want you to listen to me for a minute, all right? You know where we come from, right? We're Birmingham lads, just like you. Working-class kids who grew up thinking the best we could hope for was factory work or the dole queue. Terry looked up from his hands, his eyes red-rimmed but focused on Ozzy with something approaching desperate hope. Around him, the crowd had completely abandoned any pretense of impatience, instead listening with rapt attention to this unexpected conversation. Tony here lost the tips of 2 fingers in a sheet metal factory when he was 17, Ozzy said, gesturing toward the guitarist. Doctors told him he'd never play guitar again. Geezer grew up in a house so poor they couldn't afford heat in the winter. Bill's father worked in a steel mill for 40 years and died with nothing to show for it but black lung disease. The personal details about his bandmates' backgrounds added weight to Ozzy's words, demonstrating that Black Sabbath's connection to working-class struggle wasn't just image or marketing, but lived experience. But here's what we learned, Terry, and it's something that took us years to understand. Music, real music, isn't just about volume or aggression or making as much noise as possible to shock people. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is create something beautiful, something that shows people there's more to life than the daily grind of survival. Ozzy gestured toward his bandmates, who were now watching this unexpected turn of events with expressions of surprise and growing respect for their young frontman's handling of the situation. That song we were just playing, Planet Caravan, that's not soft music, Terry. That's music about escape, about imagination, about believing that there are worlds beyond the factory floor and the unemployment queue. That's music about hope, about the possibility that consciousness can transcend the limitations of our immediate circumstances. The crowd remained completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something significant, something that would change how they thought about both Black Sabbath and the power of music itself. You know what real heavy metal is, Terry? Ozzy asked, his voice carrying clearly through the venue's sound system. It's not just loud guitars and screaming vocals, though those have their place. It's honesty. It's looking directly at the darkness, unemployment, despair, feeling like the world doesn't care about people like us, and finding a way to transform that pain into something powerful and meaningful. Terry's head dropped, and everyone in the venue could see his shoulders shaking as he struggled with emotions that alcohol could no longer suppress. The transformation from aggressive heckler to vulnerable human being was visible to everyone present. The system that threw you away yesterday, Terry, that's what we're fighting against with our music, Ozzy continued. Not with violence or destruction, but by proving that working-class people can create art, can express beauty, can touch people's souls in ways that the powerful never expected. Bill Ward, who had been listening from behind his drum kit, began a slow, steady rhythm on his floor tom, not loud enough to overwhelm the conversation, but providing a heartbeat-like foundation that seemed to anchor the moment in musical reality. Terry, I want to dedicate our next song to you, Ozzy announced. It's called Children of the Grave, and it's about fighting back against a world that wants to grind working people into dust. It's about refusing to give up, even when everything seems hopeless. It's about the children of the working class rising up and demanding something better. What followed was one of the most powerful performances of Children of the Grave that Black Sabbath had ever delivered. Iommi's guitar work was particularly inspired, each riff seeming to carry the weight of social commentary and personal struggle. The song's message about fighting for peace and love in a world dominated by war and greed took on new meaning in the context of Terry's situation. Ozzy's vocals soared with an intensity that seemed to channel not just his own experiences, but those of every working-class kid who had ever felt forgotten by society. His voice carried the anger of the dispossessed, the hope of the determined, and the solidarity of those who refused to be broken by economic hardship. Geezer Butler's bass lines thundered through the venue like the sound of industrial machinery, while Bill Ward's drumming drove the song forward with the relentless power of social change. The entire performance became a statement of defiance against the forces that had crushed Terry's hopes and dreams. As the song progressed, something remarkable happened throughout the venue. Terry Higgins, the belligerent heckler, who had been disrupting the show, began to cry, not the quiet tears of someone trying to maintain dignity in public, but the deep, soul-cleansing sobs of someone finally allowing themselves to feel the full weight of their circumstances. Other audience members, moved by both the incredible music and the unexpected turn the evening had taken, began reaching out to Terry with genuine compassion. The people around him, strangers who had been annoyed by his disruption just minutes earlier, now offered support and understanding. Hands reached out to touch his shoulders, voices offered words of encouragement, and a community was forming around this broken young man. The solidarity that emerged from the crowd was exactly what Black Sabbath's music was meant to inspire, not individual rebellion, but collective support for those who were struggling against an unjust system. The venue had transformed from a concert hall into a space of genuine human connection. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous, but it carried a different quality than typical concert. Applause. This was applause for transformation, for human connection, for the reminder that music could be a force for unity rather than just entertainment. The ovations seemed to go on forever, washing over Terry like a wave of acceptance and support. "Terry," Ozzy called out after the applause finally died down, "I want you to remember something important. Losing a job doesn't mean losing your worth as a human being. The system that throws people away when they're no longer profitable. That's what we're fighting against with our music." Terry nodded vigorously, wiping his eyes with his jacket sleeve, while the entire venue watched this transformation with amazement and respect. His earlier aggression had completely disappeared, replaced by vulnerability and genuine emotion. "The struggle you're going through right now, Terry, that's not a personal failure. That's the system working exactly as it's designed to work, keeping working people desperate and afraid so they'll accept whatever scraps they're offered." The political nature of Ozzy's comments reflected the band's growing awareness of their role as spokesman for working-class concerns, even as their commercial success was beginning to lift them out of the poverty they had known growing up. "And Terry, next time you come to see us, don't drink away your pain before the show. Come ready to feel everything, the anger, the hope, the power, because that's what real rock and roll is about, feeling everything intensely and channeling it into something that can change the world." But Ozzy wasn't finished with his unexpected response to the evening's events. "You know what, Terry? I think you should come up here for a minute." Security guards tensed visibly, but Ozzy waved them off with authority. In 1973, concert security was far more informal than it would later become, and band members had much more direct control over how situations were handled. "Come on up, mate. I want to talk to you properly, and I want everyone here to understand what this is really about." Terry looked around in confusion and disbelief, but encouraged by the people around him who were now genuinely supportive rather than hostile. He made his way toward the stage. The crowd parted to create a path, with many people offering words of encouragement as he passed. When he climbed onto the stage, moving carefully with the assistance of a roadie who had been watching the entire interaction with obvious emotion, Ozzy put his arm around him in a gesture that was both protective and welcoming. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ozzy announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded stages for years despite his young age. "This is what rock and roll is really about. It's not about escaping from the problems of working people. It's about facing them head-on and finding the strength to fight back together." The crowd erupted in supportive applause, but Ozzy raised his hand to indicate he wasn't finished speaking. "Terry here represents every young person in this country who's been told they're disposable, every worker who's been thrown away by companies that care more about profits than people. His struggle is our struggle, and our music is his music." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a guitar pick, one that showed obvious wear from the current tour. The pick was black with the band's name printed in white letters, and it clearly held significance as a piece of equipment that had been used in actual performances. "This is for you, Terry. I want you to keep it And every time you look at it, remember that you're not alone in this struggle. Remember that there are people who understand what you're going through, people who refuse to accept that working folks should be treated like garbage. Terry broke down completely at this gesture, hugging Ozzy while the entire venue erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. The image of the young rock star embracing the unemployed factory worker became a symbol of everything that was powerful and meaningful about early heavy metal music. Tony Iommi stepped forward and began playing the opening chords of Iron Man, but in a slower, more contemplative arrangement that transformed the song from a crushing metal anthem into something more like a hymn of solidarity. The other band members joined in, creating a version of their most famous song that emphasized its themes of transformation and redemption, rather than its raw power. The story of what happened that night spread rapidly through the tight-knit British rock community. In an era before social media, news travelled through word of mouth, underground fanzines, and music magazines like New Musical Express and Melody Maker. The story of Black Sabbath's compassionate response to a heckler became legendary within weeks. Music journalists, who had previously dismissed heavy metal as nothing more than noise and rebellion, were forced to reconsider their opinions when they heard about the band's sophisticated handling of a difficult situation. The incident demonstrated that beneath the volume and aggression was a genuine concern for social justice and human dignity. Terry Higgins later wrote a detailed letter to Melody Maker magazine, describing how that night had fundamentally changed his perspective on both music and his own circumstances. He had found new employment within a month, not in another factory, but in a community centre working with other unemployed young people. The experience had taught him that his value as a human being wasn't determined by his employment status. He kept Ozzy's guitar pick as a reminder that even in the darkest times, human connection and solidarity could provide hope and strength. The pick became a tangible symbol of the night when rock and roll had proven its power to transform individual despair into collective action. The concert became legendary in rock circles, not for its musical performances, though those were exceptional, but for demonstrating that heavy metal could be about more than just rebellion and noise. It showed that the best rock music was rooted in working-class solidarity and genuine human compassion. Years later, when Black Sabbath had become international superstars and Ozzy had established himself as one of rock's most enduring figures, he would often reflect on that night as a turning point in his understanding of what it meant to be a performer and a public figure. "We weren't just entertainers," he would say in interviews decades later. "We were representatives of people who felt forgotten by society, people who were struggling to maintain their dignity in the face of economic hardship." Terry reminded us of that responsibility, and I hope we never forgot it. Tony Iommi, who had watched the entire interaction unfold from his position on stage, later credited that night with influencing Black Sabbath's approach to their audience throughout the rest of their career. "Ozzy showed us that our power as musicians wasn't just about volume or shock value," he reflected. "It was about connection, about understanding that our fans were going through the same struggles we had experienced growing up in Birmingham." The venue manager at the Hammersmith Odeon later said that the incident had changed how they thought about dealing with difficult audience members. Instead of immediate ejection, staff were encouraged to consider whether disruptive behaviour might be masking deeper problems that could be addressed with compassion rather than force. Terry Higgins went on to become a youth counsellor and community organiser, working with unemployed young people in Birmingham and using music as a tool for building confidence and community solidarity. He would often tell his clients about the night when Black Sabbath had taught him that rock and roll could be a force for social change rather than just individual rebellion. His work with unemployed youth became nationally recognised, and he eventually established a non-profit organisation that provided job training and emotional support for young people who had been displaced by economic changes. The organisation used music therapy as one of its primary tools, proving that the lessons learned that night at the Hammersmith Odeon could have lasting practical applications. For years afterward, whenever Black Sabbath played in London, Terry would be in the front row, and Ozzy would spot him and give a small nod of recognition. Two working-class kids from the industrial Midlands who had learned that music could be a bridge between people rather than just a way to make noise. Their relationship became part of Black Sabbath's legend, proving that even at the height of their reputation as music's most dangerous band, they remained connected to their roots and committed to the idea that rock and roll should serve the people who needed it most. It showed that true rebellion wasn't about rejecting society entirely, but about fighting for a world where everyone had dignity and hope. The incident also helped establish Ozzy's reputation as more than just a wild man of rock. It revealed the intelligence and empathy that would sustain his career through decades of change and challenge, and demonstrated that the Prince of Darkness could also be a force for light when circumstances demanded it. Most importantly, it proved that rock and roll in the early 70s wasn't just about volume and spectacle. It was about community, solidarity, and the belief that music could change not just individual lives, but society itself. In an era of economic uncertainty and social upheaval, Black Sabbath had shown that the best response to despair wasn't escape, but connection, understanding, and the determination to build something better together. The legacy of that night continued to influence musicians for generations. Young bands would hear the story and understand that rock and roll carried responsibilities along with its freedoms, that authenticity meant more than just being loud or shocking, and that the most powerful music came from genuine human connection rather than manufactured rebellion. Terry's transformation from heckler to symbol of hope proved that rock and roll could be a force for positive change in people's lives, not just a form of entertainment or escape. His story became part of the mythology that surrounded Black Sabbath and helped establish them not just as musical innovators, but as genuine advocates for working-class people everywhere. If this story resonated with you and reminded you that compassion can triumph over conflict, please consider leaving a like. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we choose understanding over anger, and when we remember that everyone we meet is fighting battles we can't see. True rock and roll is about lifting each other up and fighting for a better world together.